NATO says it's ready to defend allied territory against any Russian attacks. Ukraine warns Moscow is preparing for a major aerial assault and appeals for more military support. Both sides seem confident they're advancing on the battlefield. So, is the war entering a new phase? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. With much of the world focused on the escalation in the Middle East and its impact on global energy supplies, the war in Ukraine has received less media attention in recent months. That changed this week when a drone hit a building in a Romanian city. The president blamed Russia. Romania's EU partners were quick to condemn Moscow, and the NATO chief said the alliance was prepared to defend its territory against attacks. President Vladimir Putin denied responsibility for the drone strike, but he did say the war was nearing an end without elaborating. And President Volodymyr Zelenskyy warned that Russia is planning a major aerial assault. So, is there a risk NATO could be dragged into the conflict? And with tension mounting, where does diplomacy stand? We'll talk to our guests in just a moment, but first, this report from Ferdia Carr.
Surveying the damage from the drone attack in Galati on Friday that injured 2 people, Romania's president laid the blame squarely on Russia.
The entire responsibility for this incident lies with Russia, a country that has been waging a war of aggression against Ukraine for more than 4 years.
Romania's allies in the European Union and NATO condemned the strike. Secretary General Mark Rutte posted on social media saying, NATO stands ready to defend every inch of Allied territory. Reports of Russian drones in NATO territories are increasing, with similar incidents reported in Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia and Poland. But President Vladimir Putin says Ukraine is likely to blame.
The initial reaction was exactly the same as it is now in Romania. Alarm! The Russians are coming. The Russians are attacking. Yet shortly after, it turned out the incidents had absolutely nothing to do with Russian aircraft, but rather involved drones of Ukrainian origin.
Ukraine says the attack in Romania is proof Russia poses a threat to NATO and has urged those allies to provide more military support, saying Moscow is preparing for a major aerial attack.
The issue of air defenses and the need to continue helping Ukraine protect its skies is a priority. I'm grateful to every partner, to all the leaders, and to all the nations that are ready to help and that are fully fulfilling their commitments.
On the ground, President Putin says his forces are advancing in every direction and that the war is nearing a conclusion. But Russian advances since January have slowed significantly compared with the same period last year. Ukraine has credited its drones for stalling the offensive and inflicting what it says are record deaths and injuries.
There are trends indicating that Russia has found itself in a stalemate. It cannot completely end the war, but at the same time, it cannot advance along the front line.
Kyiv, however, also warns Moscow is planning a new wave of mobilization to bolster its military operation. President Zelenskyy calls it proof Russia is not preparing for diplomacy. Ukraine has been pushing for in-person discussions at a leadership level, arguing negotiations involving the US have reached their limit.
My impression is that this format is gradually reaching the point where discussions at this level are exhausted. At times, the same issues end up being discussed several times over.
With both Russia and Ukraine seemingly confident they have the upper hand on the battlefield, and US attention on Iran, there's little expectation talks will result in an end to the war anytime soon. Ferdia Carr, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
All right, let's go ahead and bring in our guests. Joining us from Kyiv is Olesia Horiainova, co-founder of the Ukrainian Security and Cooperation Center think tank. In Alexandria, Virginia, is Donald Jensen, adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins University, where he teaches Russian foreign policy. And in Perth, Australia, is Alexey Muraviev, a Russian defense and security specialist. A warm welcome to you all, and thanks so much for joining us today on Inside Story. Donald, let me start with you today. Both Ukraine and Russia seem to be confident at this moment that they are advancing on the battlefield. Where do you see the overall state of things right now, and do you think that the war is entering a new phase?
Well, I call it a stalemate, as one of the people in your clips just said. Both the front is barely moving, and certainly in small ways, Ukraine has picked up some new ground. But both sides face some of the same challenges and difficulties. Above all, troop shortage, how to combat the drone campaign, especially from Ukraine, and other issues such as, in the case of Vladimir Putin, increasing, let's say, dissatisfaction with the course of the war at home. So all of these, at least for now, I think produce a stalemate that could change. And is this entering a new phase? Well, I think it entered a new phase in January or February when Ukraine's drone capabilities increased so strongly that Russia has now even trouble bringing its troops close to the battlefront. But a second point I think is worth mentioning is that for the first time inside the Kremlin elite, it appears to be people talking about the war in an implicitly critical way. And that would not have happened a year ago when people were thrown into jail for doing that. There have been a number of very influential Russian experts talking about asking, what is the strategy here? So Putin increasingly has to, I think, be concerned about let's say the political environment around him. There's not going to be a coup, but people are asking questions in a way they didn't this time last year.
Olesia, Ukraine has warned that Moscow is preparing for a major aerial assault on Ukraine. He's been appealing for more military support from allies of Ukraine. If that support were not to be extended as quickly as Ukraine would like, where do things go?
Well, unfortunately, this is not the first time that we are facing this problem. And I mean by that, both Russian attacks on civilian buildings, residential buildings, as well as the shortages with our missile capabilities, meaning the anti-ballistic capabilities to hit ballistic Russian missiles. So what will come next? We will see, I think, in quite short time, because our Ministry of Defense, as well as the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, already stated that we are in full preparedness for the probable Russian attack, which can come in recent days. And the general warning is for all of the citizens to be extra cautious and to go to the shelters, because since the last Russian attack, when they hit just buildings, all of the missiles and all of the drones were hitting not military objects. We are not expecting anything else here in Ukraine. And this is just because, as the previous speaker stated, Russia is in a quite difficult position right now. That is why we see that it's Kremlin's behavior, which had nothing to do with rules of war before, now are just pure madness.
Alexey, you heard there Olesia say that Russia is in a difficult position. And then before that, Donald was saying that at the moment, it seems as though there are elites in Russia that are questioning whether this war is going well, that perhaps is putting pressure on leadership in Russia. I want to ask you what you understand the public's perception of the war to be in Russia and how much support it may have at this moment.
Look, I think the Russian public is getting really impatient with the conduct of the war, and it seems to be sort of an endless pace to the war. Because by way of comparison, during World War II, the Soviet army took only 40 days for it to liberate Donbass, for which the Russians seems to be concentrating their war effort at the moment from the Nazi occupation. And if we apply same logic towards what the Russian military objective seems to be, at least in the short time, it's now taken them almost 5 years to meet similar objective, even though the scale of the fighting forces involved in the fighting seems to be different, but obviously there is a different level of technology employed by both sides. The Russians were promised victory, whilst there is obviously an official narrative suggesting that the Russians continue to have the upper hand on the battlefield. They maintain strategic initiative. They applying their tactic by 1,000 cuts, slowly advancing across a massive theater of action. We're talking about a front line of some 1,700 kilometers, so it's not a small theater of war in this sense. But clearly they want some answers. They get impatient. They obviously want to see some easing of sanctions, or if not lifting of sanctions. And also we need to remember that this year is the year of parliamentary elections in Russia. So whilst there is clearly a divide of opinions inside the Kremlin walls, there are two groups of influences that try to get into the ear of Russia's president, the kind of liberal economists that really want to see some sort of a reconciliation with the West, with Europe, with the United States. They want to see a political resolution to the war, perhaps even with some concessions to be made by the Russians. And there is obviously the hawks, the neocons, the hardliners that continue to insist that there is a military solution to the conflict, and they effectively saying that the Ukrainian capacity to resist is gradually coming to its end. So they try to influence Putin by simply saying, well, do not kind of lean towards the liberal end of the Kremlin political spectrum. Listen to us, just give us a little bit more time, give us free will to act, and we'll deliver the victory that you can then sell to the people.
Donald, you know, we mentioned a little earlier that there was this drone that crashed into an apartment building in Romania. I want to ask you a little bit about the ramifications of that. Romania's EU partners, they condemned Moscow for this. Russian President Putin has denied any responsibility for this attack. All that aside, this incident has also raised fears of escalation. There are worries that this is yet another example of the war in Ukraine spilling over into neighboring NATO countries. What does all this indicate to you?
Well, it indicates to me a couple of things. First of all, I would say that I certainly don't believe Putin's explanation, but it's not clear to me, not having looked at the data, that it was either a Ukrainian drone driven off course, a Russian drone driven off course by a Ukraine response, counterattack, or whether it was a Russian provocative hybrid war kind of attempt to, let's say, to irritate NATO and warn that Russia could probably do more. In many ways, that's a side issue from the bigger question, which is to say, clearly Russia has increased its nuclear rhetoric. Clearly Russia has, let's say, continued its provocative acts, not only in Romania, but in the Baltic states. And this, to me, suggests that again, to me, reflects the stalemate on the battlefield and the hope or confidence by Putin that he can undermine NATO support for Ukraine, undermine European unity on this matter, and by hitting civilian targets hard in Kyiv, by provoking the NATO members along Russia's frontier, that, I think, is a warning to Brussels from Putin's point of view that Russia could do more. And I think the response by NATO, which has been considerable in recent months, has to be effective, coordinated, and deterrent. And this is all the more important because the U.S. appears to be stepping back from its previously support of Ukraine. So this tit for tat between Kremlin and Brussels and NATO is very, very important to watch. And clearly, that's a place where escalation could take place.
Alexey, Ukraine says that this incident that happened in Romania, they say that is proof that Russia poses a threat to NATO. Where does Russia stand on this?
Well, according to Putin, the Russians deny any responsibility for that. They accuse NATO of warmongering tactic, of an escalation rhetoric. They're obviously not going to assume any responsibility. They insist on being provided with physical evidence of the remains of the drone or sharing intelligence concerning technical and flying parameters of the drone. So there is nothing unsurprising about what the Russians are going to say to that. And again, I think after experiencing a degree of criticism and also seeing a drop in popularity according to a variety of opinion polls, I can clearly see that Putin right now is trying to engage in some damage control where he effectively is forced to explain himself, including, for example, the comment that he made a few weeks back about that the war is coming to an end. Only recently, when he was visiting Kazakhstan, he was asked to clarify what did he mean by these remarks, and this is where he went on this explainer saying, well, it's a reflection on his reading of the battlefield conditions, and clearly he also used an opportunity to escalate rhetoric with regards, for example, to the Baltic states, answering effectively Russia's concerns with regards to the commentary made by a Lithuanian official concerning potential pressures against Russia's Kaliningrad exclave, effectively saying that Russia possesses the capacity to level down any place or any country from which a threat to Kaliningrad or any Russia's other regions may come from. So it's a mix of denial as well as escalation counter rhetoric with regards to the way how the Russians perceive the current situation.
Olesia, Ukraine has been pushing for in-person discussions at a leadership level. They're arguing that negotiations involving the U.S. have reached their limit at this point. Does Ukraine feel that this kind of diplomacy can actually happen right now? And if so, what steps need to be taken to get back on that path?
Well, yes, indeed, the possible new format of negotiations is very much needed right now, and we would see in the coming months how Russia would be ready to be on this path again, because previous experience with negotiations with mediation of the United States were unfortunately nothing more than Kremlin's tries to appeal before Donald Trump and to try to take some time to win some time in this war. So a new format is very much needed right now. Russia is getting weaker. And during this year, possibly we would see the advance in this situation, meaning that if it would be so unreasonable for Russia, for the Kremlin, for Putin to continue this war, and I mean by this the losses that they're taking, because the losses have been since December 2025 at the biggest rate since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, and it's becoming very much difficult for Russia to recruit new people into the military. That is why no major offenses are possible for them. So at some point, and this point would be sooner than later, Russia would come to the moment when it would be just unreasonable to continue the war. And that is why this new formats would be needed. And European partners for sure should be around the table, should be taking the place in this negotiation process, because this would be this would consider all of our safety for the decades to come.
Donald, from your vantage point, where do diplomatic efforts stand right now? Will the U.S. be involved again? If not, who steps in to get this moving again?
Well, I think I would not even say they're an impasse. There are no negotiations, despite possible sporadic contacts in Istanbul and other places. I think the whole thing has to be reset, as they say, and without the involvement of the United States, that's going to be very difficult to accomplish and come to some kind of understanding. I think it's very interesting to look at Ambassador Nebenzya's, the Russian UN ambassador in midweek, comments which suggest that Putin has not changed his goals since February 2022. So whether Putin quietly would agree to a deal, perhaps freezing the lines in place. There are many possibilities. That may happen, but I don't see any sign of it anytime soon. On the Ukrainian side, there's no incentive at all when they have the tactical initiative, no incentive at all to give in to some of the more unreasonable demands that Russia made. And the U.S. role here seems to be fading. The U.S. appeared to try to be a broker between the two sides. It didn't work. And now the Europeans are trying to step up. You've seen talk this week about a European negotiating representative. But I don't think this is going anywhere anytime soon, save for a breakthrough by one side or the other on the battlefield.
Alexey, President Putin has said that Russian forces are advancing in every direction. He's also said that the war in Ukraine is nearing a conclusion, but he didn't elaborate on that point. What does all that mean? Is President Putin suggesting that the war will end as the result of a military victory, or is he suggesting that it will end as the result of a negotiated solution?
Well, this is where it gets quite confusing because for a long time, suddenly after meeting with his American counterpart in Anchorage, Alaska in August last year, the Russians or the Russian political elites were referring to the so-called the spirit of Anchorage, whatever it was supposed to mean, whether it meant some sort of quite informal agreements were reached as a result, and suddenly there is a speculation in Russia that perhaps influenced the impact on Russian advance, that the Russians were deliberately slowed themselves down to demonstrate that they're not trying to escalate rather than sort of slow in some instances, and obviously it coincided with Ukraine's continuous resilience and some tactical advances that they managed to achieve as part of the active defense strategy. But more recently, and as I said before, partially perhaps in response to growing skepticism in Russia, growing frustration in Russia, Putin began indicating that if war will come to an end, that would probably be driven by military resolution, obviously, in his view, in Russia's favor. But again, right now, and I believe both sides kind of find themselves in pretty similar situation, because to radically change the state of affairs on the battlefield in terms of achieving strategic gains, which would immediately lift the weight of either side before entering the political conversation that would aim towards eventual settlement of the conflict. Both sides require mobilization of substantial resources, and I think both Ukraine and Russia right now are facing the point when they have to rethink their approaches towards sustaining mobilizational capacity. For Ukraine, it's a question of whether they would lower the entry age of those who they would draft. For Russia, it's a question whether they need to go through yet another so-called partial mobilization, because as Olesia was indicating, the current system of drafting on a contract by effectively getting people to sign up contracts because of the financial incentives is no longer producing expected dividends as it used to over the past few years. So it's effectively a major checkpoints for both sides when they need to effectively decide what sort of follow-on strategy they need to adopt. If they're talking about lack of political will to negotiate right now, and there is a lot of bad chemistry that have obviously is quite clearly visible between the two heads of state. Even the question of where possible face-to-face negotiations are to take place. Obviously, the Russians are not going to agree to a proposition that these negotiations could take place somewhere in Europe or in America. Right now, the Gulf region, which may seem to be one of the alternative places, is unstable and unsecured in its own right. So even trying to find common ground where Putin and Zelensky could hypothetically meet, if there's going to be a will for them to meet in the first instance, is a challenge in its own right.
Olesia, I asked Alexey earlier about where public opinion stood when it came to the war in Russia. I want to ask you about people's attitudes in Ukraine. Where does the public currently stand when it comes to support or lack of support for the war?
Well, in Ukraine, we don't have any changes since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, basically because we were attacked. So every person in Ukraine is very much supporting of the course of our government, and the highest rate of trust is still from Ukrainian people under the many pollings that were being taken since the beginning of the full-scale invasion remain on Ukrainian armed forces. So we, as all our government, our president, we still stand on the fact that we need to fight back. We need to end this war on the terms that would be at least okay for Ukraine and for Europe, because in this conflict, we are defending not only our country. So this is not a question, and this would not change in the foreseeable future, and this is what Russia is trying to change with this massive attacks on civilians. And every time it fails to achieve this aim for the people to go on the streets and to ask for the end of the war, because we Ukrainians want this war to end just.
Donald, we just have about a minute left. I'm going to ask you to be very quick, please, but I saw you reacting to what Olesia was saying. I'm going to let you jump in for a final thought.
Well, I very much agree with what Olesia says. There's a complete resolve on Ukraine's side to win, and there seems to be less resolve on Putin's side to win, or at least as Alexey said, and I agree, people are asking questions. So this is going to go on for quite a while, unfortunately, and I think the pressure on Putin and his elite will increase, and that may, whether it's in the Duma elections in the fall or in other ways, have an effect on Putin's calculus. We just have to see. But certainly, Ukraine is showing the world that it can defend itself, and the lack of progress on the battlefield by the Russian side, I think, gives hope to a lot of people in Europe, as Olesia said, and especially in Ukraine. So I think this will continue for quite a while, and I don't see Russia getting out of this anytime soon, unless it takes really some serious escalatory practices, which can trigger a bigger crisis.
All right, well, we've run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the discussion there. Thanks so much to our guests, Olesia Horiainova, Donald Jensen, and Alexey Muraviev. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website. That's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For now, that's it from me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here. Al Jazeera's coverage continues in just a moment. Stay tuned.